Creepypasta Story.
The House in the Woods. The group of friends Max, John, Steph, and Wendy had been hiking through the dense woods for hours. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, and the forest seemed to grow more ominous with each passing minute. Their intended campsite was nowhere in sight, and a creeping sense of unease began to settle over them. Max, with his brows furrowed and jaw clenched, scanned the map repeatedly. Wendy's eyes darted nervously between the trees. Her lips pressed into a thin line.
"We should have been there by now,"
Max muttered, his grip tightening on the map. His face was tense, eyes flicking back and forth between the map and the surrounding woods.
"It's getting dark,"
Wendy said, her voice tinged with anxiety. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her wide eyes reflected her growing fear.
"Look, there's a house up there. It looks abandoned, but maybe we can stay there for the night."
John pointed ahead, his eyes narrowing as he spotted something in the distance. His face was set in determination, but a flicker of doubt crossed his features. The house loomed in the distance, a dilapidated structure nestled deep within the woods. Its windows were shattered, and the paint was peeling off in large flakes. Despite its eerie appearance, it seemed like their best option. As they approached, Steph shivered, his arms hugging himself as he cast wary glances around.
"This place gives me the creeps,"
he said, his usually bright eyes wide with unease. He hunched his shoulders as if trying to make himself smaller.
"Come on, it's just for one night,"
John reassured, attempting a confident smile that didn't reach his eyes. He placed a hand on Steph's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze, though his own posture was stiff with tension. The front door creaked ominously as Max pushed it open. Inside, the house was dark and musty, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned under their weight.
"Home sweet home,"
Steph said sarcastically, though his voice wavered slightly. He forced a smile, but it quickly faded, leaving his face pale and drawn. They set up their sleeping bags in the living room, huddling together for warmth and comfort. Max built a small fire in the fireplace, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. Wendy sat close to the fire, her knees drawn up to her chest and her face illuminated by the flames, showing a mix of exhaustion and fear. She glanced nervously at the shifting shadows, her teeth chewing her bottom lip.
"Let's tell some ghost stories,"
John suggested, trying to lighten the mood with a forced grin, but the strain in his eyes betrayed his true feelings. He sat with his legs crossed, leaning forward slightly, as if trying to project confidence. Wendy shook her head vigorously.
"No thanks. This place is creepy enough without any help."
Her voice trembled, and she hugged her knees tighter, her eyes wide with fear. As the night wore on, exhaustion overtook them, and one by one, they drifted off to sleep. The house seemed to sigh around them, the old wood settling and creaking in the silence. Max awoke with a start in the middle of the night. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dim red glow. He glanced around and noticed that John was missing.
"John?"
Max called softly, trying not to wake the others. His heart pounded in his chest, and his face tightened with worry. His eyes were wide, darting around the room as he rose to his feet. There was no response. Max grabbed his flashlight and stood up, the beam cutting through the darkness. He walked through the house, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. As he reached the end of the hallway, he saw a door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, Max found himself in a small, dimly lit room. John was standing in the center, staring at the wall with a vacant expression.
John, what are you doing?
Max asked, his voice trembling as he stepped closer, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. His body was tense, and his hand shook slightly, causing the flashlight beam to waver. John turned slowly, his eyes wide and unseeing.
The house. It's alive.
He murmured, his face devoid of emotion, like a puppet. His movements were slow and jerky, his expression blank and unsettling. Before Max could react, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as he pounded on the door, shouting for help, his face contorted with terror. His breaths came in quick. Back in the living room, Steph and Wendy were jolted awake by Max's cries. Steph's eyes flew open, and he quickly sat up, his heart racing. Wendy looked around wildly, her face pale with fear. She sat up quickly, her hands trembling as she clutched her sleeping bag.
What's going on?
Wendy asked, her voice trembling.
It's Max!
Steph said, already on his feet.
Come on, we have to find him!
His determination was evident, but his eyes betrayed his fear. His movements were quick and urgent, his face set in a grim expression. They followed the sound of Max's frantic pounding to the end of the hallway. The door was locked tight, and no amount of force would open it. Steph's face twisted in frustration as he tried the handle again and again. He pounded on the door with his fists, his jaw clenched in anger.
Stand back!
Steph said, grabbing a nearby chair. He swung it at the door, his face set in grim determination. The wood splintered with a loud crash, and Steve's expression was a mix of hope and fear. His eyes were wide, his lips pressed into a tight line. As the door gave way, they saw Max standing alone in the room, his face pale and terrified, his eyes wide and wild.
Where's John?
Steph asked, his voice edged with panic. His hands shook as he gripped the remains of the chair.
He was, right here.
Max stammered, his hands shaking.
He said the house is alive.
His voice was high-pitched and frantic, his eyes darting around the room. Suddenly, the room seemed to come to life around them. The walls shuddered and the floor buckled. A low, menacing growl echoed through the house as if it were breathing.
We need to get out of here.
Wendy said urgently, her voice high-pitched with fear. She pulled on Steph's arm, her eyes pleading. They raced back to the living room, only to find the front door had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. Max's eyes darted around in desperation, his breath coming in short gasps. He ran his hands through his hair, his face contorted with fear.
The windows!
Max said, rushing over. But the glass was no longer broken. It was intact and unyielding. He pounded on it, his face a mask of frustration and fear. His fists left smudges on the glass, and he let out a strangled cry of despair. Panic surged as they realized they were trapped. The house seemed to be shifting around them, the rooms changing and twisting. Steph's voice trembled.
It's playing with us!
He said, his eyes wide with realization. His face was pale, his lips trembling.
Why is it doing this?
Wendy whispered, tears streaming down her face. Her voice was barely audible, her expression one of utter hopelessness. The answer came in the form of a cold, mocking laugh that resonated through the house. The walls seemed to close in, and a sense of malevolent glee permeated the air. Max's face twisted in horror as he realized the house was sentient. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. In the chaos, Steph was suddenly pulled into the floor, the wood swallowing him like quicksand. His eyes widened in shock, and he screamed.
Help me!
Max and Wendy grabbed his arms, trying to pull him free, their faces contorted with effort and terror. Their muscles strained, and their eyes were filled with desperation. But the house was too strong. With a final desperate scream, Steph disappeared, leaving only silence behind. Max and Wendy were paralyzed with fear. They clung to each other, knowing that escape was impossible. The house seemed to revel in their terror, the walls pulsating with a sinister energy. Wendy's face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide with hopelessness. Her body shook with sobs, and she clung to Max as if he were her only lifeline.
Please, let us go!
Wendy sobbed. Her voice was barely a whisper, her face a mask of despair. The house groaned, the sound echoing like laughter. It seemed to savor their fear, drawing strength from their despair. The walls began to close in, the ceiling lowering. Max's eyes darted around frantically, searching for any possible escape.
We can't give up. There has to be a way out.
Max said, his voice shaking. His eyes were wild with fear, his face contorted with determination. But as the walls pressed closer, it became clear that the house had no intention of letting them go. It was a predator, and they were its prey. Wendy's eyes squeezed shut, her body trembling as she held on to Max. Her face was pale, her lips parted in a final, silent scream. With a final agonizing scream, the house consumed them, leaving no trace of their existence. The forest grew silent once more, the house standing as a silent sentinel waiting for its next victims.